It's recording
It's
right now.
recording.
Good. All right, we're going to take a few minutes of this.
Here is the honey.
Well,
Honey?
what we're gonna do is just test first.
That's right, this is our test.
We don't wanna burn ourselves out, but you know.
This is testing. That's right. Do you want to count to 10 or
If
something?
there's gonna be any brilliant conversation, don't say it now.
Yeah.
We'll obviously
So let's move it
be
up
able to
here
say it
now.
later.
Now,
Okay, this is test
Are
one.
we going to have brilliant conversation? Is that what we're here for?
Just
I think you've got the wrong crew.
Or do you want the truth?
Well, we're
All the
supposed to
above.
talk about being
Yeah, I think
pragmatic.
Recording.
Yes.
Okay, now what's the subject? By the way,
Subject is growing up in your family.
growing up.
And
We
what I would
didn't.
like to start
That was the whole
asking
trouble.
each of you is would you first recount if you could only tell one story about your growing up to your great great grandchildren.
Who's good? Are you
What would that story be?
Are you gonna be the main question here?
No.
Okay.
Because the main question is
Ought
to
to
sit
be over
here,
there a little bit
right near
more.
the camera.
Yeah.
Because
So we
we
can
could
keep
look at
switching
too far.
chairs. Yeah.
I mean, we can look off at this angle, say here and here even, but you can't look over here.
Yeah. What we ought to do
That's right.
is everybody look cross-eyed, and one can sit on one side and one on the other, and we can handle it.
Okay.
It seems like a practice.
Now, anybody, are you gonna ask questions?
We're all going to.
Well, you should sit next to Jim.
Just answer me.
What?
Just answer to me, no matter who asks.
Oh, okay. all
Just
right.
pretend you don't know anything about
Yeah.
video.
And
By
look
the
at
way,
the
Answer
camera.
the question.
By the way, anybody in front of a camera is called the talent,
Oh, one word?
regardless
Of
of.
whether or not they have any.
Yeah.
We're in serious jeopardy here, folks.
Then automatically you're known as the talent, that's it.
Did you hear the sound when it was playing before? That was important.
Oh, how did the picture come out when
The
you were?
picture looked reasonable. The sound, we're going to have to talk up, and we got to close that door.
We gotta close that door, okay.
The sound is
You're going to have to speak up.
slightly, just a slightly tinny side because the camera mic, so that way you need a lavalier to get a good clear thing.
And that's my professional opinion.
So if you could tell one story to your great great grandchildren about what life was like growing up in your family. But actually, while you're thinking about that, let me just ask them some details. Mother's full name.
Eleanor.
Harris. Purdy.
Okay, born Eleanor Harris.
Born Eleanor Harris.
What is the date today?
Date today?
It's a good question. I don't know.
8.
I would want my grandchildren to know,
The
and my
eighth?
great-grandchildren to know that I belch a lot. I think that's very
I
important.
think that's already been established.
Yeah.
This is
No.
August the 8th, 1972.
1992.
1992.
Right.
Get wrong here.
If you remember the
Okay.
sixties, you weren't there.
Right. So just to put some details in it, her name was that. Do you know her parents' names?
We're not quite sure what her parents were. They changed their name when they went to England. They were born and raised in Lithuania, which is now Lithuania near Kovno. A little place right on a suburb called Kovno-Gabarin. And their name is not quite sure what their name was.
We know what their name was in England.
When they moved to England.
Yeah, they changed the name in Harris.
Probably because the old boy was a tailor. And he was into Harris tweeds and the equivalent. You know.
Well, also the other name they felt probably was too hard to pronounce or something, So.
Okay, this
Anyhow.
is Eleanor's parent.
Yeah.
Any guesses at their?
Now, we had another parent.
No, we'll
Yeah,
come back. and
Yeah, we did.
But this,
There were two haploid cells, you know.
any,
The round ones come from the women, and the ones with the tails on them come from
Now,
the men.
we're just talking about the
You
round.
knew this
thing
thing
about
by now,
mother.
didn't you?
Huh?
But mother, we should know, mother was born in Detroit.
What year?
1898.
7?
1898.
Jimmy's right.
1898.
We have confirmation from the back. Jimmy's
August
right.
2nd.
You
Okay.
flunked the test, Eddie.
She, for about
She-
70 years, had a different birthday, however. It was in July. somewhere around July 26th or something like that, but the year 1898 is definite. And we got a copy of her birth certificate, and it showed baby girl Harris.
Okay.
1898.
Okay, your father.
Well,
Name and
Harry
birth?
Martin Purdy, and he was named after a family relative, Harry Martin. But I'm not sure,
Who
you
he
know,
was exactly.
I think he was an uncle. Yeah, I think he was an uncle.
Yeah, well, that's how Martin became a sort of family name from then on in those days.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't there, so I don't know the answer.
Yeah, well, this is what I was told, you know.
Do we
You
know
weren't
what?
there because you were the baby, right?
He was the favorite.
None of us were
uncle,
born,
Harry
actually,
Martin.
when this was established, so
Yeah, when,
makes it a little harder.
yeah, when our father was born, there was no one yet born of the kids yet.
When was he
Good.
born?
2 years older.
Than your mother?
Move it over,
Yeah, so-
1896.
Do your own figuring on that.
Yeah, 1896.
Do you know where he was born?
2 years older.
Do you know where he was born?
Yes, Fort Huron, Michigan, which is a suburb, practically a suburb of Detroit. You know, it's not a real suburb, but it's a little city right on the lake
Huron,
Huron. Yeah.
right at
Do
the
we know-
entrance to the St. Clair River.
Yeah.
Do you know anything
Stones.
about who his parents were?
Well,
Where'd they come from?
Well, it was Edward Purdy
Was his father.
was his
father, right.
And they came from where?
They had been in Texas. In fact, Dad was conceived in Texas, and then they came up to the Fort Huron area.
But his parents.
There, by the way, we ran across the name Purdy in the people who were in the Alamo. What was this Purdy's name, Betty? Mark Purdy something, or I've forgotten the name. But at any rate, the middle name was Purdy, clearly a family affiliation. The last name was something else. But the Purdys were in Texas during the great battle at the Alamo.
Dad likes to tell it that we're descendants of the Purdy rifle.
Yeah.
That's right, made in England, and he had articles on that. It was spelled P-U-R-D-E-E.
And P-U-R-D-E-Y.
Yeah, a couple of derivatives, but the Purdy rifles and shotguns. That's his story.
Yeah, but his mother and father were both born in England.
Whose mother and father?
Dad's. No. Oh, no, that's right. No, that's right. That was
How about the
several
grandparents?
couple generations.
Yeah, a couple generations
Yeah, right.
before.
But I mean,
They-
Mother
English
suspects there was a
descent.
Frenchman in there.
the ancestors came from England and possibly a little Irish and so on.
Well, Yorkshire was where the name came.
When was the
And
French
the
Canadian?
derivation of Purdy is
The
thought
French
to
Canadian.
be
There was some relative, I'm not too sure, was named.
like our grandmother.
Was named Gay.
Her maiden name was Gay.
Gay, so that's kind of a French, you know.
Your grandmother's maiden name was Gay.
That is
Grandmother on
correct.
whose side?
And her sister
Yeah.
spoke
Grandmother-
French when they
On
came
the
to visit.
father's side.
Your father's mother, maiden name Gay.
That is correct. And her name was Catherine, oddly enough. And that
Yeah.
is
Where this?
how Kathy got her name.
Which is, of course, how
Yeah.
Catherine Tamsin gets
Yeah.
rich.
Catherine's sisters would come to visit from Canada, and they spoke French when they were together, which would seem to indicate that grandmother Catherine was well, Gay is both English and French, but it is not Irish, and Dad claimed she was Irish, and clearly she wasn't. She was either English descent or French descent, and we don't really know. But her sister, they could have lived in Quebec and spoken French and English both.
Your grandfather was a tailor?
My grandfather was what?
Was a tailor?
No.
No, that was
No.
Grandfather Harris.
That was
Grandfather
Mother's.
Purdy was,
Mother's.
Right.
was a very romantic chap in that well, the thing Dad used to like to talk about was him hauling lumber out of Canada on a sailing vessel.
Yeah, he became a captain on a sailing vessel.
He
on
owned the
Great
boat,
Lakes.
and according to our cousin Edward, cousin Edward said he had 3 boats going. He was captain of one of them, but he had 3 boats hauling lumber out of Canada into the Detroit area. So he was a tough character. Well, illustration. Dad was telling me about putting a wash a tub over his head and pulling it up and down and making it go boing, 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 boing. And his father said, "Don't do that anymore, stop." And he had pulled it down, you know, the boing down. He couldn't hold it there forever, so when it went up, it went boing again, and he got a whipping. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
You didn't know that story?
It
Yeah.
doesn't surprise me a lot. I was
Yeah.
scared to him. Mother wasn't all that fond of him. She said he was a little bit tough guy, hard guy, act like a sailor at home in the house. That's what she said.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. He was a
Or more
tough
like a
customer.
captain, act more like a captain and tend to order people around and that sort of
Yes,
thing.
well.
So she didn't much care for him.
Yes.
The way it goes. So anyhow, we have a lot of sea connections in the family and that generation around there. My father, he worked in shipyards. Dad worked in shipyards, for one thing. And then another uncle, the oldest of our uncles,
Uncle
on
Pearl.
that side, Uncle Pearl, he was a diver for a while, and there was some objection. The family said it was too dangerous, so he started going on as a sailor on the Great Lakes, and he was lost. The ship he was in went down, and all the crew was
Yeah.
all drowned, and
He
they
was
only
mate.
found pieces.
Yeah, he was made on the ship. It was a whaleback steamer, and they believed that the boom broke loose and turned over, and she, you know.
Yeah, they sort of
blew
found
up.
pieces of it. That's all. They
Yeah.
never did find,
Clearly, being a sailor is safer than a diver, though.
Yeah.
Not for him.
You know,
Not for
all
him.
things don't work in this life like you think they're going to.
Yeah.
Probably this big.
Okay,
Okay.
the children in your family. Firstborn,
Four
firstborn was,
Harry Martin Purdy Jr.
tell us about it.
Well,
He was older than all the 3 of
the
us.
first, yeah, I think that's the first thing.
He
looked
was
at-
almost 4 years, about 3.5 years older than I am. He was.
Yeah.
And
He probably looked more like Dad than any of us did.
could be, too bad we don't have the bus to get him to show.
Yeah.
Well, he was a number, well, of course I remember him from all the way back, and he and I were very close. He was sort of my protector because I was a little scrawny, asthmatic kid, and he would sort of protect me in all sorts of things. And in many ways, he did
They
all
both
the way
picked
up.
on me.
But,
Mother liked him better.
Yeah.
well, he was kind of favored, He was a good-looking chap, for one thing, and talented. And I remember, well, all the boyhood memories, maybe for me, not anything super notable, except I remember a number of incidents of him protecting me when kids picked on me, that kind of thing, But
They probably picked on you because you were so ornery.
ornery? Probably so. I was the weakest 40-pound weakling in the whole area for ornery. Anyhow, Harry, typical of Harry, he was a very bright guy, and when he was in high school, he got bored after going through all the courses, sort of thing, and he took up he took up calculus on his own, and he studied it and so on. He became very advanced in that. He had a dual side to Harry had a dual side. He was a technical science type. At the same time, he was a romantic, yeah, but a social scientist and a humanist, that sort of thing, you know. And he became a writer, among other things. And
He wrote for Scattergood Baines, I remember that. It was an
yeah,
early
that was
time soap
an
opera.
early radio play. He did that, and a couple other radio plays. I mean, he did a
So
lot
they
of
got
this
on
to
the
make
air?
money.
Oh,
Huh?
yes, yeah, he
Oh,
had
yeah.
things on
Oh
the
yeah,
air.
yeah. He wrote let's see, in probably 1936 or something like that. He wrote a play called The Battle of Bull's Run, which was about the sit-down strike in Flint.
Uh-huh.
And that was also got on the air, and by then he was a young radical and so on, and the parents didn't quite approve fully of that, but I remember my mother sort of taking a strain
To say the
It was
least.
it was on the radio, his stuff, and she said, that's my son's play on there, and his was quite radical thing about the big sit-down strike and all that sort of thing.
Well, he also wrote for Esquire.
Yeah, he
Short
wrote-
stories, a number of them.
He has one short story in June 1937 issue of Esquire.
Do you have a copy of it?
I had. It was lost in my,
We'll
Oh,
get-
he
we'll
wrote
get-
another one too.
June
There was
1937.
another one.
and
Something about somebody stirring up social problems by plugging the holes in golf courses and things like this, as I recall.
yeah. Well, he was he was the guy. He was kind of, like I say, extremely close. We were best friends, you know. And in college days, he was out to college, and then when I had run through my little time in Wayne City College, then Wayne University, and then I went out and I got away from home. I ran out to University of Michigan. He was already there for a couple of years and sort of well established, and he helped me get settled and, you know, made sure I got things to eat, which during that time, say in 1938, was you know, a lot of people weren't eating very steadily, and helped me get a little job washing dishes and a job in a
Something,
place. And
something
that sort of
he
thing.
could really do.
Yeah,
Well.
well, I wasn't too good at that, actually. But anyhow, Harry, in the meantime, we were both in radical circles, you know, at that time. And among the people in the radical circle are some people that are still well known and going, you know. And
In jail, what?
Miller's first name. Arthur Miller was one of the circle at that time, and Harry was
In that
writing-
area? In that area, he was living in Michigan then?
Oh, well, he was going to University of Michigan. He was
Miller
one of-
was, oh.
Yeah, he was one of Harry's friends. I knew him, you know, but not very well because I was several stages younger. And besides, Harry had things published in literary magazines too. You know, these, literary magazines. I don't know the name of the thing, that sort of thing. You know, so there was
None of the
there were-
remainder of us are members of the literati.
And there were a lot of
Ill
other
literati.
well-known people in this group too, you know, a guy named John Malcolm Brennan, who's been known for all sorts of literary stuff and so on. And I forget others, Merida Wolf, who wrote a novel called Whistle Stop and it got picked up by Hollywood and all that sort of thing. So, anyhow, what can you say about Harry? Here he is, you know, this guy who's, you know, got this scientific bent and the other side of him and friends and all these things going on there at University of Michigan. And, well, should I
Go
at this
ahead.
point go
Go
into the
ahead.
whole
Tell us.
story of Harry, sort of?
Let's
You
Tyler.
know how he left and where he went, where he
Yeah.
worked.
Well, he was, after he graduated, and I didn't graduate, I had other things to do in university, felt I would be better at other things, you know. I was taking engineering, which I really
Tennis.
hated. And the dad would only.
That's blasphemy, Buster.
Yeah, and, well, it was sort of ironic because Dad, he said, I will only help you in school, because he had a nice steady job by then, out there, which my subsidized $5 a week, which is, a lot more than it is now, needless to say. But he said, only if you stay in engineering school, because all the rest is a lot of blah, blah, blah. These people talk, but they don't, do anything, sort of. And that was one of Dad's little quirks, that he wasn't quite that bad, but that's what he's told me about. So anyhow, when Harry finished, graduated, then he got a job in a machine shop. And very quickly, he became a very highly skilled gauge maker, which is right up, the section of tool and die making, which is a big specialty and so on. He just picked this stuff up. That's the way he was, So, one fine day, well, he was married. He married one of the college queens and all that sort of thing. They never had children. They didn't have a chance because the war come along at that point. And so one fine day, we decided, well, a good part for political reasons, that this war had to be won. So 3 of us, Harry, myself, and Alan, went down and volunteered for the Air Corps and passed all sorts of tests. And typically, Harry, the tests, the intelligence test, which I don't particularly think measures intelligence, but it's an
Aptitude
indicator.
for-
Yeah, for
aptitude
living
for-
with this, and they're all cultural bias and so on, as far as I'm concerned. But anyhow,
That's probably why I did so well.
he got the best in that whole district, the area of Detroit, that had been done up to that point. This is a very bright guy, in any case. And Alan and I were not too far.
You were
down
right
there.
behind him, and Alan was right behind him.
Well, I don't know that it ran 1, 2, 3, but we were all, pretty.
Up at the top.
I think Bob
pretty
was about the
close.
3rd and I was about the 8th, something like that. But those guys had college education and I didn't. Just think what I could have done if I had
You're
an
grasping for
education.
straws. You're making excuses here. Well, some people think you became the brightest even, sort of thing, because.
Well,
But at any rate, so we volunteer. We have this picture. I'm sorry I don't have it here. This would be a nice thing. If we were
Sure.
gonna edit this, we'd take a picture. There's the 3 of us on the back of the Detroit News with the picture and the photo pictures back there. All 3 of us standing there proudly.
And the Detroit Times and the Detroit Free Press.
Yeah,
All
and
3 papers.
3 brothers volunteered for the Air Corps. Their father's an engineer working on tanks at Cadillac at that time, yeah. And the mother is a nurse's aide who is working, volunteer work in hospitals and that sort of thing. It's a patriot story at that time. Well, anyhow, so.
We all went off to war.
Yeah, we all went off, and Harry went off last because
Yeah.
I forget the circumstances why exactly.
They didn't want to
myself,
release
but-
him from his work.
Yeah, that was one thing, and actually, he finally got released. And meantime, Al and I were going through this training and all that sort of thing. And so, well, Harry went through his training, and,
Yeah, he split the center section of a PT-19 out, landing one time. But since he had such a good academic record, they decided not to wash him out. He hit a fence post coming in the land.
And
A little
then
too
they,
close to the end of the runway.
see, I didn't get into the details of the college time. That was a big time together, and after college, after college, there was one period where I was married, when he was married, and we all lived in the same little apartment together for a while and all that. So we were close all the time. And one of the last things that before we went in the Air Corps is we hired in a place called Sperry, which was not a British connected one, but was one that did aircraft work, and we were engaged in organizing the place, trying to organize the UAW. And so we were both on the organizing committee, and anyhow, we we were sort of always together like that. You know, we worked on projects together, we saw each other all the time, and so on. He was really, for me, something very special. And so anyhow, in the Air Corps, he got in, and I only saw him once in the Air Corps. It was the last time I saw him, and he was in, I think by then, basic training or something, or it might have even been primary, I can't remember. And I was in advanced training, and I got a chance to fly in and spend the day with him. And we walked around and talked and enjoyed all that sort of thing. And then, you know, I went on my way with this thing, and he went on his way, and he ended up in B-24s, and he was...
Before he left, just before, well, I think he had, no, he hadn't finished. He was in basic, I think, and I had gotten pneumonia a couple of times, and I was in advance. He came by when I was in the hospital, and we traded hats. I had a really nifty officer's hat, and he had one of the moldy cadet hats. We traded hats, and the agreement was he was going to give that back to me after after he graduated. But we talked for a while, and that was the last time I saw him.
So that was our last day together. And we did correspond a little bit when he was in England, but not very much because we were both, by then, I was tied up in Germany on a thing there. But anyhow, so he flew out of England through a number of missions and all that, and then he was shot down on June 19th, 1944 over Germany. And he was killed, and 3 other members of the crew. And I talked to a couple of crew members after the war, and they told me what happened. And I don't, believe in heroism. I believe in heroism, but heroes are rare, because most of us were doing what you had to do, sort of thing. It wasn't anything extraordinary. But this, what this guy told me, I forget, he was the commander of the plane, and he told me, he said, I'll tell you what happened. He said it was one of those things. Harry was flying as co-pilot, and the plane was hit, and it just wouldn't fly anymore. But there was some control. It was going down, and the nose gunner was trapped in the nose turret, couldn't get out. And so the commander said, everybody bail out, this is it, and so on. He said, go. And he said, Harry hung there. He said, wait a minute, I'm going to try a little. He said, no, everybody out, everybody out. And then he said, I'm going. And he said he jumped out, so I was with him. Well, it turned out that Harry stayed in, tried to land the plane, and just, crashed. Killed him and the one that was trapped in the nose turret. They never got him out. But he stayed in because he wouldn't believe, well, this guy was in this, So, that's about as hero. I saw a lot of things going on, but I didn't see much of that. Yeah.
When was that?
Well, the date was this June 19th, 1944. I was always happy because at least after D-Day,
Yeah,
I saw which
very
was
short
going to happen.
time. Yeah.
And then after the war, I got his letters that he was writing to other people, to Gladys and so on, and my former wife. And one of his letters said he just learned I was a prisoner of war. I was shot down, he just learned I was a prisoner of war, and he said, it's the happiest day of my life. That Bob got through this at this point. And
You were a guest of the German government?
yeah, well, it was a year and a half I spent in there.
Yes.
We have a
So-
great memory of him, from his college days, and that was by Lillian Russell, right? The sculptress who did the bust.
Reuben.
Lillian, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
We all have copies.
Mine is damaged.
So, we'll take a shot of that.
You know,
That makes some sense.
what, you know, you alluded to the fact that you were now a guest. How did that happen?
Well, I was.
Where were you stationed?
Well, I had a funny thing, because I went all through fighter school, but then they had, as they told us, they took 90 of us out of fighter transition in Florida, and P-47s, they said, oh, there's very heavy losses in bombers right now, so we need people to be transferred over there without any kind of transitioning. So anyhow, I like a bunch of others, we put in right directly into 4-engine bombers, B-24, which is the same plane Harry flew, and so I went here and there and then, you know, and I finally ended up overseas.
Where were you, by the way, in Florida? Do you recall?
Oh, Tallahassee.
Tallahassee.
Yeah, they used to be. Yeah.
Well, there's a P-51 base, or I mean, a B-24 base, you know. Well, I'm flying out of it right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Fort
Yeah.
Myers.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, make a long story short, let's say
It's too late.
It's already too long. Yeah, well, it seemed longer, you know. And you mentioned casually, a year and a half, it seems like a lot, like 10 years. But anyhow, so I got into, I was on a crew, a model crew, and I was just learning this as a co-pilot and all that sort of thing. Some guy got sick that was leaving, the plane was leaving from overseas in Wichita, and so they said, any volunteers, would you like to? I said, yeah, I'll go now. You know, so anyhow, off we went. We had this big long flight overseas from Wichita to Puerto Rico to, God only knows where we are, then British Guiana, which is now Guyana, and Georgetown, and then down to another stop, I forget where it was, anyhow, Natal, Brazil, and stayed there a week while I renovated the plane and so on. Then we flew it across, and here we are, you know, kind of all amateurs, you know. The navigator, it turns out, he could navigate theory, but not in practice very well. And so I did a lot of the navigation, you know. Here we are sitting on the map, and, you know, telling the navigator. gives
That's
a
the
heading.
ocean, all right, yeah. Right there.
See, I was flying co-pilot, and then the navigator would give us a heading, fly 273, and I would sort of look at the pilot, and I'd say, about 10 degrees over further. I can see by that lake over there, we're not going there. So the whole thing went over that way. So we flew across the ocean, anyhow. We landed in a number of interesting places, you know.
None of which they were aiming for.
No. We actually pulled through, you know. We did some funny things here and there, but we went to Casablanca. That was a refit outfit, and we went out there in the ocean, fired all the guns for the first time, and that by throwing a marker in the sea and that sort of thing. And they took things out and put things in, you know, they refitted it for combat. Then we flew to Tunis, and we landed there, and that was Air Force headquarters, which was then the 9th Air Force, which was very shortly changed to the 15th. It went out for a long time, the 15th, so we have the war. It still exists, I think. At any rate, so over there, out into the desert, we had a desert base, and we started flying missions out of there, you know.
That's where you flew the Strawberry Bitch.
Yeah, right.
Strawberry Bitch is
Oh, yeah.
B-24 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base Museum.
Yeah, right, and we bumped into it. Margot and I were just visiting there, and there's this plane, the Strawberry Bitch. Here's 18,000 B-24s were made, and here's this one in the Air Force Museum. It's this plane that I flew one mission, you know, because I did a lot of miscellaneous flying, fill-in and cruise and stuff like that, a utility man, I did. Sort of thing. Okay, I started flying missions out of there over the Mediterranean into bombing Italy and these places like that. A couple places in southern France and a couple places in Greece, Yugoslavia, and so. And then we moved up. The whole group moved up to a little tiny town called what was the name of it? It's right near Brindisi, down in the heel of Italy. And so then I continued to fly missions out of there. Lower Germany, Augsburg, and a few other odd spots into that area. And then one over in northern Italy, we flew a mission on Christmas Day, 1943, and it wasn't completely, we were hitting railroads mainly and marshalling yards and so on, and it wasn't really smashed up bad enough, so we thought we'd fool them. And when I say we, it wasn't us who made the decision. Intelligence would tell us, okay, you're going here.
Oxymoron, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, right. Military intelligence is one of the great oxymorons of the world. But, anyhow, so we went back 3 days later on December 28th, and somehow the Germans got wind of it, and they threw everything in the whole area at us, some 80 fighters, and our group was supposed to be with another group that had to turn back to the bad weather, and all our fighter escort never rendezvoused with us. And in the classic Air Force maneuver, we didn't turn back, because the Air Force was people never turn back, even when they should, in my humble opinion. But anyhow, so
Either rain or sleet or snow.
no, that's the
that's the
post
mail.
office.
There's some certainty.
But they could have learned something, I think, from that. But anyhow, so that day we, as I said for 15 times already, to make a long story short, we ran
come
into
on.
these 80 fighters. And then one of our planes turned back. There were 17 of us left, and we had an air battle that lasted maybe 10 minutes. And out of the 17, there were 11 of us shot down. Well, this is a 10-man crew, see, so there's a lot of people involved here. And we shot down probably 30, 35 German fighters.
That's
all
really
very
surprising
quickly.
amount.
Yeah, oh yeah, it was. But that's because they were doing really, very
Just lining up.
kind of heavy attacks that were kind of like kamikaze, practically flying right through our formation almost.
Running into each other, probably with 80.
Yeah, there
planes.
were a few of those too, So anyhow, we got shot down, and we circled down, and there were 4 of the people were killed in the plane, and everybody else successfully bailed out. Everybody was wounded in either landing or hit with something, lost an eye, broke a pelvis, and so on. Except me, I had no scratch on me, and we had a little discussion about that with one of the guys later who was religious, and he said, it didn't work out like the way, it's supposed to normally do, because you're not very religious. In fact, you're not religious at all, which is absolutely true. And anyhow, so I got captured and went through a couple of various little things here and there, interrogation centers, and that sort of thing, and ended up in Stalag Luft 1, which is up just 2 kilometers from the Baltic, almost directly north of Berlin. And I spent a year and a half there, so in pretty crappy conditions. And,
How did you get captured?
how? Well, I landed in a parachute, and here it was, December 28th, and there was snow in northern Italy, and it was in the grape fields, but there wasn't any grapes to leave, and you could see about 40 miles or something. And I landed, and a couple of Italians come running over nearby, farm worker types, and they said, we'll hide you. So I started trotting along with them, and then we saw in the road, there was a motorcycle and a sidecar with a couple of German soldiers, and it come zooming down. It turned out they'd been watching with binoculars, picking up parachute people that came down. And so the Italian guys ran and dived places, and I dived into a big deep ditch about that deep, so my rump was sticking up. So they came over, and then I peeked up, and the first thing I saw was this guy with a machine gun here, like that, and he sort of saying, not Benicon, that's Spanish, what do you say in German? come to herein, or something like that. Anyhow, so that's how I was caught. And it was a very weird thing. It was so, they put me in with the other guy, and we went by, and we were driving back to their airfield where they came from. That's where some of the fighters came from, over there. And we were driving along, we saw a couple of crashed B-24s, and one of them he pulled over quite close, and there were people, guys from the crew laying there, So they brought me to this airfield, and and the first, that was sometime late in the afternoon, they locked me up, and and then, being an officer for my meal, my first meal in Germany was at the officers' mess. Here's all these German officers sitting around, sort of looking like this. And I'm sitting there, and I didn't have much appetite. I tried to eat a little something sort of thing, and but it was really weird. I just felt that was really weird because I was an officer. You'd eat in the officers' mess. Makes sense, right? Well, things went downhill from there.
Yeah.
Literally like that sort of thing. So, and then they picked us up and took us up into Germany on a train. They took all our heavy flying stuff away from us because it was winter and they didn't have to watch us so well to try to escape in this 10-foot snow all up in there. So, yeah. And then went off to other stuff and ended up in camp. There's naturally a million stories in this kind of a thing like this sort of thing that I'm not very much of that. So that was that.
Who was that guy that hit you with the umbrella?
Oh. Well, it was one of these odd things that we.
A likely story.
Yeah, it's a likely story.
A man hit you with an umbrella?
Well, it started this way that we got on, oddly enough, on a streetcar in the city of Frankfurt, where we were going to the first place, the interrogation center. Here we went on a streetcar with German guards and about 20, 30 prisoners, all air prisoners. And so we got off the streetcar and we started getting attacked by civilians, irate civilians yelling at us and stuff. And one guy particularly picked out me or whatever, and he came up to me and he had an umbrella and he started hitting at me, and I didn't get any real blows, glancing blows, and he was yelling in English, Jewish gangsters from Chicago, Jewish gangsters from Chicago, And my reaction was to tell him, look, I'm not from Chicago, I'm from Detroit, I'm only half Jewish, but I thought this is not a place to discuss these things.
No, it really wasn't.
So eventually a few people got hit, the people got hurt here and there, and the guards stood there with the cameras and laughing as these people were doing this. So, yeah.
They were probably mad because you didn't pay the fare. Ride on the trolley free, and they had to pay.
I don't know whether they paid the thing,
Anyway.
but anyhow.
So tell us about life in terms of when you guys were all kids together.
Don't
How
you
much
want to know what
overlap?
I did in the war?
Yeah.
I read their letters religiously, and I wrote them quite a bit, which for me was a chore. And after that, I went to my own war, the Korean War, and I played sports for 2 years, and I had a hell of a time. And that's probably why I limp and everything today. Now, back to our childhood.
Do you want to wrap up?
And we'll
the-
also come up with his war too.
Yeah,
World War
well,
II.
Do you want to
everybody
wrap up
has
the
a
war
war,
experience?
yeah.
I got out.
What was this? We went to a lake, and Lake Erie was it or something, and nobody knew how to get there, and Harry said, well, you go down this road until you come to a man plowing the field, and you turn right.
We went to Point Pelee.
Yeah.
Over in
Yeah.
Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in general, what we used to do, the big recreation for us was the vacation for Dad
Yeah.
was going to the lakes around Michigan, because we lived in Detroit at that point. We lived in
Yeah.
several other cities there too when we were young, but
We went to the Upper Peninsula when Harry was in the CCC and camped
Yeah.
on the shore of Lake Michigan.
But that was the big vacation, was out to
Oh.
one of the lakes, either
Yeah.
one of the Lake Huron or,
Lake Huron was a refrigerator.
yeah.
God.
Lake Erie
Where-
was the
And that's-
coldest, though.
Where did you live? Do you remember the address? What house in Detroit?
Colfax.
We lived in a number, naturally. Before that, it was 1361 Seward,
Seward Street, yes.
and I don't remember any other address that I've ever lived at.
That's where I got hit by a car, wasn't
Yeah.
it? Seward?
I think that's the one where we were, family was evicted too.
Oh, that's possible.
That was the
Yeah.
one, because I was in grade school then, and
Yeah.
the Depression, the Great Depression had hit, and all these things went out, and Dad lost his job, and
No, he was teaching drafting.
yeah, but no, what it
That was
was,
afterward?
he was working, but he started his own drafting school in the house. And what it was, not just drafting, it was tool and die design he was teaching to private students. And he had maybe five or and he was just getting this thing
Yeah.
going. He was then
Bottom
the
graph,
equivalent of mimeographed book like he made up for all the students and that. And it was really doing well. They liked him because he had this tremendous talent for this stuff. And then he lost his job, his regular job, and this didn't bring in enough money to pay the rent. And after missing a couple of rent out, he went to the street, the whole family. You know.
How old were you then?
I probably was,
You had to be about 8.
no, I was older than that. See, this was, oh no, you're right, you're right.
I think
No,
I
I
was
was,
4.
see, I was 10 in the.
Jimmy wasn't.
I was probably 11 then, see, because 1930, I was 10 years old. And this was right after 1930, just starting there sometime. So I was about 11 and you know, Jimmy wasn't at all.
I was
I
right
know.
after that.
Yeah, you were coming right after that.
You were a haploid, so.
Yeah, right.
Here and there.
So, that's what happened then.
Yeah. Well, that,
And-
I remember certain things about that place in Seward.
You ought to.
Yeah.
You burned the damn
Burned the garage
down. A 4-car garage. You and one of your little playmates were playing with matches out in this garage, and things got out of control. And the first thing, suddenly all the fire engines were out there, and this big garage was burning along with at least was it 1 car or 2, I forget, was in there. And you and your buddy were. Do you remember much about that time?
Oh, I remember
Right.
that. I remember burning down the garage quite well.
Yeah, well, you tell about it. I'll tell one little.
Probably had nothing to do with the eviction.
Who knows?
No, that was another story. I think.
Yes, well,
Why did you burn this garage down?
why? Because it was fun to play with matches.
That's
why.
good enough for you.
Yeah, that's really.
There's nothing wrong with that. Don't feel guilty about it.
How old were you, Alan?
I think I was about 4 then.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. We were playing with kitchen matches.
Probably 5.
We would take these kitchen matches, we'd find a car that was parked, and we'd open up the gas tank and drop a lighted match in.
Jesus God.
We did this, we kept on doing this, you know, and they would just, a little fire would go down and there, nothing would happen, till we found an old Tin Lizzie in the field. And we dropped a match in the sucker and it blew. And singed all our faces.
I think you were 5 or 6.
Yeah,
roughly.
that was after I was hit by a car and my brain was damaged.
My parents weren't gonna have any more children after Alan in the garage, but they didn't know how to stop it, so, or what was causing it.
Yeah, right, that's, yeah.
Yeah, I can still remember, here we are looking in this gas tank and we dropped this light back. Boom!
And do you remember what happened when everybody, the fire department came and all that, and this big
No, I
fire?
don't remember that.
Well, let me just put in one little thing, and that is that I looked at you and you had this funny look in your face. I think it was more of a smile you were suppressing or something like that, and I got suspicious.
Kinda
right
like
away
now.
For a lot of reasons I got suspicious, from past experience with Alan. And so I sort of corralled him and I said, what happened? He said, nothing. And so I kind of leaned on him a little and he said, well, it wasn't our fault, we were playing with matches and stuff. And I said, okay, we're not going to talk about this to everybody. This is something, nobody knew this for many years after that Alan's involved in there.
You thought his eyebrows came off naturally, or?
No, that was.
No, that was another episode of that. But this was, in other words, I sort of helped cover all this up because I felt it was not a thing to talk about in public,
Actually, I think that pretty well cured me at playing with matches.
Well, that's, we all have our own way of learning.
Didn't keep me from burning down garages, but it
Yeah.
did.
How
At
many,
another
how
house.
many garages did you burn down in total?
Well, but you
Got a house attached
I
to
only
it,
know
so
of
it
one,
makes
you
sense.
know?
But you gotta see this picture.
Now I'm
Here was
hearing
a
about
big
two.
4-car garage with at least 1 car.
All wood.
Big, all wood out in back of
tar
this
paper
Six
lining
Flags where
inside.
we live. And this thing just went up and it was a spectacular, huge thing. That everybody was gathered, all the neighbors and everything, looking at this thing like this. It was really, great fun, sort of.
They get back.
But I went on into greater things, as you know.
Yeah, I know.
I failed the third grade twice. Not everybody say that.
What do you think really happened?
What do I think really happened?
I mean, that's very strange, Dr. Mark.
Well, I don't know. I don't really know. I know I was enjoying life greatly. That much I remember about that. When I was that age, I do remember. I drew a lot of pictures, and that one of the teachers remarked on that. In fact, and I sang a lot. And I played in the trees nearby the school. I can remember jumping from limb to limb and things like
He
that.
was the only one with a tail.
What was happening at home at that point?
Oh, Dad was working for Rio, as I recall, about that time, wasn't he? R.E. Olds, Rio Motor Car Company. He was the chief draftsman.
Yeah,
On
right.
trucks.
Well, we moved to Lansing because that was in Lansing then.
Yeah, that was in Lansing.
We moved around a number of places because of the job situation.
I think that may have influenced my great success in academia at that age. I don't know.
How old were you when you knew how to read?
Hmm?
How old were you when you knew how to read?
Oh, I knew how to read early. I was, by the time I was 13 or 14, I was a speed reader. But I learned by reading, interestingly enough, Green Hornet pulp magazines, which I got, I learned to be a speed reader at that a fairly early age, I'd say 13, 14, when we were at Colfax.
Yeah, well, you weren't allowed to have them, so you had to read fast.
That's right. Yeah. No, I can't account for my lack of academic success at my early age. I went along, well, typically at Colfax. You may not remember this. Mother goes in, I go into the 6th grade. Mother goes in, she becomes head of the PTA, and I'm a real bummer on the I'm a real bummer in the class. So they have two sections. They have the odd section and the even section. All the good kids are in the even section, and all the bad kids are in the odd section.
Guess which one we were in?
Well, I was in the even section
And?
until for one grade, the 6th grade, and they decided.
One day.
No, I went all the way through, and they then sent me to the 7th grade in the odd section. That's where the blacks were and the various miscellaneous misfits, and that's when I started getting all A's or B's at that time. Excellent. I had a nearly perfect record there. I was voted the most versatile boy in the graduating class from the grade school, but they couldn't have a boy from the odd section winning the most versatile boy, so that year they had the most versatile boy from the odd section and the even section. And my arch rival was a guy who had stolen my girlfriend. They made him the most versatile boy in the even section.
What did versatility mean?
Well, I'm not sure. We won, for instance, we won a soccer game between the odd and the even section. The odd section won easily, and so they forfeited the game to the even section because one of our people swore during the game. It was that kind of a way. But I went on to go to junior high school, and they said I was getting really good grades, and I'd taken an IQ test in the 6th grade, and they decided I was retarded or something. And so they called me in, one of the advisors, these psychologists, and they said, Alan, are are you getting a lot of help with your homework? And I said, no. And they said, you know, is your mother or your dad or your brothers, are they helping you? And I said, no. And they couldn't explain it. The fact I was getting mostly A's, you know, at the time. And, you know, there was some fundamental change. One thing I did notice, one thing I really did notice, however, was on occasion, and it only happened a few times that I can remember, I would lose track of where I was in time. And I think at that time I was a borderline epileptic. You know, I'm suspicious of that at that time. I really am. Because that's one of the things that shows up when practically nothing else shows. So I think I was a borderline epileptic, and it may be there was just some flip-flop in my brain along the way, and I became a good student afterward. And I was always an honor student afterward. Yeah. But my parents never believed me. They sent me to Cass Tech to become an electrician because they figured I'd never make it through college.
Remember what grade school you went to?
Patton Gill.
Pattongill, yes, I remember.
What junior high school did you go to?
Oh, there was a small junior high school over there on the other side of Grand River in Livernois, and I don't remember the name of it. I do remember some things about it. I remember seeing a girl that I knew very well by the name of Mary Hogan. She and I were friends. I saw her killed, hit by a car, a bicycle, you know, crossing the street near the school. That was a bad experience, man. That's, I don't remember much about junior high school. I remember Cass Tech, because I learned to be an electrician, which I've used all my life. So it's a really handy thing.
Oh, waitress.
See, we were all hopping around to different schools because we moved around a lot. You know, from that period, in 29, 30, we moved to Lansing, we moved to Flint, we moved to Roseville. Remember Roseville?
Very little. Well, I remember some things about Roseville.
Yeah, well, that was one of the last things that, you know, because Harry was in high school then at Roseville and went out for the football team, and he decided it was a little too rough game. It was kind of stupid, you know.
I remember from my childhood, very early years in Lansing, Michigan. This is before we moved back to Detroit. And the boys would take me out and tie me to a tree in the bank of the river, and they would go fishing. So I couldn't get away.
Yeah, well, now this isn't as cruel
And a
as it
snake would
sounds.
come up, or did
Oh,
come up
a life
one
of the
time.
story.
A snake came up, yeah, just once. Well, that was enough. Of course, nobody believed that I was tied to the tree. Mother and Dad just didn't think her sweet little boys would do that.
We didn't do that.
Yeah.
That was two
This
other,
is a-
We
there was
didn't,
a couple other
we didn't
boys.
do that.
No.
Not at all.
What we did, we tied a rope to the tree, and we took Jimmy as far as he could go to keep him from falling in the creek, because there was a fairly steep bank, and we tied him off at that length so that he could
Then
move
they added 10
around.
foot to it, and then
He
tied
wasn't
him.
tied directly to the tree, he was tethered to the tree.
Yeah, well, that's
so
a
he
little
couldn't
bit-
drown. We
It
were
wasn't like we
actually-
nailed you to the tree, you know, you're
Yeah,
exaggerating.
It probably would have
Well, I
been a
still
good
have the
idea.
marks from the nails. It probably explains the ability to walk on water.
You're exaggerating.
Yeah,
That's one of the ways.
I remember that. That was very, very young. That was probably 3-ish, I think. Yeah, that's yours.
Well,
I'm virtuous. I don't drink, so.
Or do you have any other cause?
you know what my earliest memory was, though, and that is my father holding up his .30-06 rifle and me firing it. You know, remember he had a pot-bellied stove out in the field, and that's my earliest memory. I was probably about 3, maybe.
I remember some of the early cars that Dad had, like the Hudson or Essex Terraplane, and that big Hudson with the trunk on the back, the leather
Oh,
trunk,
yeah,
the brown
yeah, that
one,
was
and
a
the black
great
leather
old
top.
car. Yeah.
And that was a real piece of work. And I remember one time running up to meet the car, and Dad rolled up and parked on my foot. And
Well, you were a little accident.
I was yelling at the top of my lungs, and Mother came out, and Dad did move the car ultimately. Probably took a punch at me while I was there. No,
Don't exaggerate.
no, not really. And
Yeah, you know, Dad, it was always interesting, these kind of, all during the Depression, he managed to keep some kind of a car, except there were short periods where he didn't. Like, in 1930, he bought a brand new Essex, one of his first new cars, and after we got evicted, we moved in with other people and so on. Somebody snitched, because we weren't paying payments anymore, of course, and somebody snitched, and they come and took the car in the night. Took his old Essex, brand new
Dad
Essex,
got out of his
that really
rifle
burned.
and he was gonna shoot him, and Mother talked him out of it.
Well,
I
it was
remember
really,
that
yeah.
very well. Yeah.
But the cars, all the Depression, he managed mostly to keep cars, like I say, a few periods, but, and these cars were often complete wrecks. I mean, I remember driving along, and the car burned out a rod, which was kind of, I don't know.
Yes, I remember that incident.
Dad went, so here we are out in the country, you know, and this is a big serious thing, so he went under, pulled the pan off.
Yeah, he drove over a ditch, so he.
Yeah,
got
so
out.
he could get under there, and he pulled the pan off. He found which of the bearings one bearing burned out. He pulled it off, and having no replacement, he took his belt and he cut a piece of leather, and put the leather in the bearing, and put it back in there, like that. And we managed to drive very slowly, and drove all the way home.
Oh, this is a true story.
Artificial,
I remember
it's
this.
amazing, and other things of that nature went on with these cars, you know, these old cars that would fall apart, he would sort of just fix them at
Now,
one
how
way or
old were
another.
you then? How old?
What?
How old were you then when that happened?
Oh, I really don't remember. It was kind of the, you
You
know,
were in junior
middle of the
high school
Depression,
anyway.
something like that, yeah.
Yeah, you were
something
kind of
like that. I probably,
Junior high school, and I was
14, but
I was
he had a
like-
genius of doing that kind of stuff, you know. It was absolute necessity.
there was another time driving down a road, and there was a lot of laughter in our car because a tire went rolling by, and then everybody's laughing about somebody having lost a tire. It turned out it was us. The rear axle broke, and when it got to the bottom of the hill, the car started scraping and dragging along. So then we had to go retrieve a tire. That was just a little tight then, too.
Yeah, and friends that we would go with, we'd go out to a lake for recreation or something. And they had these old rattle traps, and one time I remember driving along the old gravel road.
Breaky was out in front of
Yeah, it
us.
was Breaky.
Yeah.
And, you know, there was big clouds of dust and all that, and suddenly Breaky disappeared, the car disappeared. It turned out, well, what was it, the tie rod broke, and the wheel went like that, and it ran out in the field. You know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
they all go sort of like, that's too bad, you know, this whole.
Yeah, they got some baling
They all
wire.
climbed under and, you know, put the thing back together, and off we go down this old, you know, back roads. Life was kind of, you know, perilous, they're living on the edge, sort of disaster a lot of times, you know.
Yes.
Old cars.
I think that's where we all got our mechanical abilities from.
Yeah, but that's a double-edged sword, you see. There's one thing you have to realize, we have a genetic flaw inherited in the Purdy family. We prefer to fix things rather than buy new, or we, you know, if we hadn't stopped to fix so many things, we'd probably be wealthy people because we would have earned so much more money.
Maybe that's a genetic thing there? not
Oh,
fixing?
yeah, definitely.
Really big.
Yeah.
I know all three of us failed map folding in college, I know that for sure.
But one of the things I remember about all this time was I was always coming in the school in the middle of the term because we just had moved back to Flint or someplace, you know, and I missed a lot of stuff. You know, I never really got into know much about medieval history to this day because that was in between, you know. But it was hard because I was always, you know, we'd get all of us, you know, we'd have friends, and then suddenly we'd pack up in the middle of the term and just take off.
In the middle of the night.
Yeah.
A lot of the packing was was done in the
Well,
middle.
All of that, you know?
No, well.
But it was just,
fine for
you know,
them.
move.
Mother and they ended up, you know, losing their teeth because they couldn't repair them, they
Yeah.
couldn't afford to repair them, things like that.
And I was affected that way too. I never saw a dentist. I had the cavities that were years old. you
Yeah.
know.
Oh, yeah.
And also, I was turned down when I was sick with asthma, at least one time, by our family doctor then. When we ran out of money at the time, he just wouldn't treat me. He said, I can't do that. I have to make a living too, or something like that, whatever his excuse was. I've been interested in healthcare ever since.
Yeah.
That was the beginning.
I wondered how that was gonna get into the conversation.
Yeah. Well, those were tough times,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, I don't think we realized how bad they were.
Yeah.
You know, as kids, we were having
Right.
a good time being alive and raising hell and doing things kids do.
Yeah, there were things you'd notice, you know, especially when you think back of it, like, there was one period we were eating almost nothing but canned green beans.
Yes, I hate green
That they
beans. to this
raised,
day.
yeah, they raised these green beans in somebody's friend's lot out there, and mother canned them, and we just kept eating these beans, you know. And I hate,
I
especially,
don't eat vegetables to this day because of Dad in the blender.
yeah.
He had probably one of the world's first blenders.
Yeah, right.
And he would bring all this
Osterizer. it was.
stuff and put into this thing, including dandelion greens and grass.
Yes.
And it would be either greenish or yellowish, depending
And
on
Dad
whether it
would
had
want
more
us to
carrots.
drink this stuff.
Yeah, and I refused
See how
to eat
easy
it.
you had it, Kathy.
I simply refused after a while. I did it for a little bit. I said, I'm not gonna drink this stuff anymore. You know, we had to have it for breakfast and lunch, and he was a real health nut that way. And I refused to drink it, and Mother, after the second day, started smuggling food to me. Because Dad wouldn't let me eat until I drank my stuff. These guys caved in though.
Yeah, look how much
Well.
healthier we are than you.
Yeah.
Right.
Bigger,
right.
stronger.
Would you like to stand up and we'll compare?
What do you want to compare?
And it's on.
Yeah, a lot of things, you know, the funny, I don't wanna get big theory here and all that, but the funny thing was that, you know, I noticed certain things, you know, well, I'm older than the other two, in the Depression that weren't normal kind of things going on, it's little things that hurt here and there. None of us at this period, I never had a bicycle, you know, I always wanted a bicycle. And I didn't realize why, it took me a while as I got a little older in the Depression, why there wasn't enough money for bicycles and things like that. It was, you know, too busy trying to.
I finally, I
Keep going,
earned a
you know.
bicycle during the Great Depression. Paid $4 for it. And I earned it, you know, hauling ashes. And that was tough work, you know. There'd be a pile of ashes about the size of this table, and we would, you know, somebody dumped outside their door, and we would shovel this in one of the little red wagons and take it, you know, someplace or another, and I've forgotten where, probably to another neighbor. or
Yeah.
something. and you know, a huge pile. I said, well, I'll move it for 50 cents, you know. And my friend Louis wasn't very bright, but he was very nice, and he and I would shovel ashes and move this pile away. So that's how I earned the bicycle, the $4 bicycle.
My first bike was financed by Dad. It was a Sears and Roebuck, and it cost $15. And I went out and got a paper route, and then discovered, you know, it was spread all over the place. I had 43 customers. So in order to cover this area and get the paper there on time, I had to have a bicycle. Well, Dad had enough money at this point that he was able to buy the bike, and then they took it out of my earnings from the paper route. That was my first real job. I
Yeah,
never
well,
had to work as hard
Yeah,
as
but
you guys.
probably his last real job too.
But you know, there were periods of within all these years of the Depression was kind of like 10 years long. There were periods of, for us, a little prosperity when Dad got a pretty good job and worked steady for, you know, 6, 7, 8 months, you know. Then a lot of goodies came in and so on. And then it would be layoff time again, and the bad things
Uncle Charlie and a couple others were always able to get together with a case of beer. I don't know how they got that.
Well,
There was a great deal of drinking during those days.
Yeah.
I remember
Relatives.
a classical afternoon in the basement of my Uncle Charlie's, where Uncle Charlie and Dad had assembled a homemade still. And they had this still going, and they had a shot glass at the end of this copper coil, and it would drip, drip, drip. And when it got filled, one of them would drink it, and they took turns.
Yeah, but they also said, this stuff has gotta age, but we gotta check it first. And they kept checking and checking, and never had a chance to get aged, you know. I saw the same, I remember that very
And
well.
they were very eager about beer too.
Very
They
well.
would, when they capped the beer, they put a chunk of dry ice in it, the beer they were making. I think it was all illegal, of course. They put a little chunk of dry ice in it, and it would immediately become carbonated. So they could drink it rather rapidly, rather than waiting for it to age.
Didn't one of your relatives have a speakeasy?
Oh, yes.
Uncle Dave.
Uncle Dave.
He became quite wealthy, by the way, with his
Yes.
speakeasy.
And it wasn't only the speakeasy, just the beginning of before the speakeasy, he was engaged in, he didn't actually drive motorboats across the Detroit River and bring it himself. As far as I know, he never did that, but some of his friends and acquaintances did, and that's how part of the money came for the speakeasy, which is not far from the Detroit City Hall down on Grand Avenue, Grand River, Grand River was.
Right around the corner. Back door of the bus station.
Not far from the police station. It was, you know, and one day, and then after Prohibition was over and all that, he had a bar underneath it, a legal bar, and that's where a lot of money came in. And one day he took me up into his speakeasy, where the illegal bar, and it was still there for years after.
Oh, yeah.
you
I
know.
was taken up there too, and all the antique light fixtures were still there, the glasses, and a lot of cups. They served everything in cups, he told them, was still there on the back bar. The thing was just complete, only with this much dust on everything.
No,
Yeah.
well, the
Yeah.
plain fact was the mayor and the council came there to have their drinks because it was the closest speakeasy.
Dave's
Yeah.
Bar and Grill.
Yeah, right.
And the Greyhound people cut a hole in the back of their building into the alley so that they could come across into, well, first of all, up the fire escape to get to the speakeasy. And then after that closed down, then there was a door that led right into the bar and grill that was underneath it.
And I think he was the wealthiest one in the family for,
Oh,
you know, up until you
By
guys.
far.
So I don't know which one of you is the most wealthy, but you know.
Ah. Ah, yes, well,
Now, what does speakeasy mean? Is that a legal bar
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was,
during Prohibition?
Speak easy, speak easy, you know, be quiet because, you know,
Don't let anybody know it's
It's also
here.
known as a blind pig.
yeah.
No, that was the girl who lived on the corner.
Ooh.
We are really good at this, aren't we?
well,
Anyway,
yes, well, there were some really interesting times, like I used to build, when I was in Lansing, I can remember building push carts. We lived right next to a great hill, it was several blocks long, and we would make these push carts and get them going, you know, and just go down that thing. It seemed like miles. Of course, I was much smaller then, so everything seemed bigger. I can remember this huge house we lived in, and I went back there many years later when I was an adult, and sure enough, that house wasn't very big at all. It was just an ordinary kind of little two-story house. You know, and I didn't really look at the hill. I probably should have. It was probably not very big either.
Well, and Lansing was an interesting place, when it was pretty nice for the kids then, because all of us, I mean, because we lived on the outskirts of the city, and we would go up to this gravel pit and go swimming.
No.
big
all
open
sorts of
fields
things.
all around it.
Yeah, and we would go over, and there was a creek over there, and we would go fishing and catch little rock bass and little other things and bring them all home. to
Tie our
Mother.
brother to the tree.
And Mother would
Best of
say,
times
yeah,
and the worst of times.
yeah,
Mother
all these
wouldn't
little,
clean the
all these
bushes.
little fishes probably this big, you know, a whole pile of them.
Yeah,
She
we
would-
ate a lot of them though. We
Yeah.
ate them.
Oh, yeah, we ate them.
Sure.
She wasn't all that fond of the cleaning thing.
Well, there was going out there in the winter, the golf course would flood. You remember the golf
Oh, yeah,
course
yeah,
nearby?
right.
And the water would come up over the golf course, and it would form a thin ice, which we called as kids rubber ice. And you'd run along on this thin ice, and it would cause a wave ahead of ice. It's very, you know, that was good fun. You remember that at all? No?
I remember you pushing through it, but I don't remember.
Head first was.
I remember flooding at Colfax, the backyard, building a snow ramp all around the edge
Oh,
by
yeah.
the driveway, and then we would go out and flood it and skate around the trees.
Yeah, that was one of the great recreations,
Yeah.
living in Michigan.
It was one of the only
Troy,
recreation,
yeah.
because we were very poor at that time. And that's when I found out there was no Santa Claus.
No, what?
No Santa Claus.
There isn't?
Jesus.
I hate to break it to you guys, but yeah, I was like 4 years old, and I wanted this desk in the worst way, and they said, well, Santa will bring it, Santa will bring it. And I went to bed, and I heard this big clattering and banging, and it was Bob, and I believe, I don't know, was Harry or not, and Bob and Harry and Dad trying to battle this desk. It wasn't that huge, but to me, it was a huge desk into the house. And then the next morning, it was from Santa Claus, and I was destroyed.
We just told you.
Do you remember the electric train I bought you from my hard earnings
I
from my
remember
paper
electric
route?
train, and I remember you taking part of the electric train at a later date and building a box and trying to electrocute Tommy the cat.
I did that?
Yes. You built a box about this wide.
Oh, that was for
Yeah.
rat electrocution.
Yes, well, you were testing it on the cat though. And he nailed the lid on with one nail, and he plugged it in, and he had the milk at one end and a plate at the other, and the cat came out the top. That's another time he clawed the hell out of you. Time he tried to teach him to swim out of the kayak, he did too.
Toward the, I think
What
we're
about the
probably
time you
running
painted the cat?
close.
The cat and I never really got along.
You know, one of the things, Uncle Charlie, most of the Depression, Uncle Charlie had a job in Plymouth. He was a superintendent. He managed to hang on to the job most of the time. He helped out the family off and on too, in big crisis. But anyhow, toward the, I can't remember the year anymore, but it was getting toward the end of the Depression, and he managed to get Dad a job in the tool room in Plymouth. And that was the last, he never had a layoff again after that. And it must have been 36 or something like that, 37 in there. And then from then on, then he got into drafting and so on, and Dad had a job steady from then on. And that, you know, ended the worst of the Depression for the family, anyhow. A lot of other people still had problems and so on, but we did fairly well after that. Now, Uncle Charlie, he retired and had a little tool grinding every place. And the whole family, all during the time, was
Genetic.
was in the auto industry
Yeah.
in Detroit.
Chuck Purdy
Uncles
was-
and
yeah,
God, everybody
Uncle
was
Chuck
in there. you
was,
know?
he was tool, well, not a tool and die maker, he was a machinist, wasn't he?
Yeah, yeah.
No, well,
Yeah, I think you could tool work too.
Yeah, the whole family.
And then a lot of them became engineers beside Dad.
Yeah.
Worked his way into engineering, basically, you know.
Yeah, Dad was a self-taught
Yeah.
engineer.
Yeah.
What kinds of things did he engineer? What did he do?
what's that?
What kinds of things did his engineering, what was he doing? What sorts of things did he design?
Well, he put the ride in the Cadillac for,
Yeah.
what is it, 24 years?
Yeah, he
something
was a
like that.
senior frame and chassis engineer for Cadillac Motor. He had a
Yeah.
very, what they called a sensitive ass.
Well, actually, Mother was the one who gave him that title, as I recall.
Well,
He
no,
would
she called him
ride-
some other kind of an ass
Yeah.
sometimes, but,
He would ride,
Yeah.
he had roads around Detroit where he would ride the Cadillacs, you see. And he would ride and he'd feel them kind of, and then he would go back and say, you know, stiffen it up here, do this, do that. And so my mother said that Dad had an educated ass. That was it, you know.
so he was known at work for that too, because he designed the cruciform frame, which was kind of a copy of what Mercedes-Benz had done, and that was a big tube, center tube that went down the front of the Cadillac and then branched out into a Y affair at the front and the rear, and the suspension hung on that. And that went on for several years, and then they made some other developments, but he just knew how to fine tune a chassis and which bolts needed more torque or stiffer rubber mounts and things like that. You know, he'd go for a ride and he'd come back and he'd say, well, the cowle is shaking. Okay, let's do this to it, add some shims and take some of the rubber out and tighten it down, and do that. Then you realigned the fenders and made everything look right, you know, did it again. And
At one point, he was in charge of commercial frames.
Oh,
too.
yeah.
Yeah.
Commercial
you know,
bodies, he'd come
commercial
home with
bodies,
purses and
frames,
park them in the
yeah.
driveway.
yeah.
Really?
And,
That's really.
All kinds, we had every kind of car there was in the world. Rolls Royces, the old Mercedes Gullwing 300 SLs. He would bring those home and for ride comparisons. And when he was in the commercial chassis design, he got a lot of great gifts and things. But one of the things he brought home once was a car for King Saud of Saudi Arabia, who had 26 wives. And Cadillac Motor made the basic car, and it was shipped to Ohio, and the rest of it built.
Probably the first stretch model.
It was a monster, yeah. It had 6 doors and a sealed driver's compartment from the rest of it. The only thing I remember really about it is Lois and I, who was before we were married then, riding around in the back seat, Mother and Dad in the front, talking on the intercom, going to see an old friend and getting stuck in front of their house because it had no traction. So Mother and I and Lois are out pushing this huge thing, which was bigger than a hearse.
And they didn't have video cameras in those days.
Yeah, you know, and the tires are spinning, and we're all covered with slush, and, and Dad drove off.
But you know, at one time, there was a lot of Purdys in Detroit. You know, Harry and his wife, and me and my wife, and you and your wife, and all the uncles and so on, and most of them connected with the auto industry and so on. And now I don't think there's many left. The only one I know about is cousin Harry, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, his son.
And his
Harry,
son,
Harry died.
Tiger.
They used to call
Tiger.
him Tiger. When he was,
Yeah.
But he's the only one I know left. The only Purdy left out of that whole gang. That must be.
He's still
30 or
machining
more.
parts for the automobile industry, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we
he's
had
still-
one favorite
yeah.
uncle. We had one favorite uncle. Well, I think, of course, Uncle Dave was a favorite, but it was Uncle Walter. And Uncle Walter, on the Purdy family, loved to play with kids.
He invented hot ears.
Oh my God, I forgot.
Yes?
Yeah.
It's big, it was
Yeah.
big.
Yes.
Now Walter was never terribly bright, as far as I could make out, but he was a joyous individual, you know, and he loved children, and he would
Like
wrestle
people.
with us.
He was, you know,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
people
just
loved
a
it, you know, and he,
great guy, great guy.
yeah.
Yeah. Of all the uncles, I remember him best because he played with us as kids, you know. He
Yeah.
enjoyed us and we enjoyed him. I can remember tumbling down the stairs, you know, from upstairs and wrestling with him on Colfax there. You know, I also had, at that time, we were building model airplanes, and we got gas airplanes, you know, gasoline motors, and I can remember I bought a cheap engine. It was probably $5.95 out of my newspaper earnings, and
That's not adjusted for inflation, so it probably
Yes.
was $57.
yeah, that was a lot of money for me to put out, and the thing was, this engine was not very good. And I hardly get it started. And I can remember I had found an old grinder downstairs, hand grinder, where you turn these things, and it really gets the wheel going up. I'd taken a mason jar cover and put it on the engine, and with the propeller, and I ran I don't know what it was, some sort of a cord around that and this grinder, and I was able to get it really turning up, and I finally got the engine going, and the whole air, the whole end of the house turned blue with carbon monoxide. You don't remember that, eh?
I remember that. I remember the planes you made with microfilm and little thin balsa, and you
yeah.
make the
I
microfilm in
wasn't
the
good at that.
bathtub,
Yeah.
and then he would stick a fly, catch a live fly, and put on there, and then turn them loose. And these little planes would zoom around behind
Yeah,
the
that's
fly
right. That's right.
with wingspans about this big.
The flies would power them, and we discovered that the smaller flies had a better power to weight ratio. They flew much better than the bigger flies. A blue bottle fly was a disaster as a power.
I think they were smarter. They said, "Why should we haul this around?
No, it was a little house.
We'll
fly.
hire the little ones to do it."
How did you attach it to the fly?
With glue. What
Glue.
else?
Glued up.
Very small screws.
Lassos? I really didn't
Yeah.
know.
A drop of glue. It was very hard to get the fly. You had to hold their wings out, and then the other person had to attach this little thing and then hold everything still for a second till it stuck.
It's sort of a family trait, you know.
Yeah. Then when it wouldn't fly anymore, they would pull their wings off and let them walk around. No,
You did.
not Alan did that.
No, you ate them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I
How old
also
were you then?
remember-
How old were you then when you did the fly tricks?
Oh, we-
No, that was when you were doing the whipped cream fight.
He was in high school and I was in grade school
Uh-huh.
at that time.
Yeah.
But I can remember Harry coming home, and he built little V-wing flying wings.
Pushers, yeah.
Yeah, with, no tail on them, very tiny. And one little bitty rubber band, a little bitty.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was flying those around. I had a rubber gun. And I kept on shooting at these airplanes as they flew by. I finally hit it, And he beat me half to death before our parents pulled him off.
Unfortunately, we kept hitting him in the head all the time.
Which accounts for today's actions. Remember the one painting that you hated the worst in the world that was at Colfax?
I can't remember that.
The Laughing Cavalier?
Oh,
Remember,
yeah.
we used to take and put a piece of paper over his face. It was a Spanish
Cavalier.
conquistador or cavalier or something, but he had this evil leer about him, and we would continually put a piece of paper over his face. And Mother would come unglued all the time, That
And
went
then
on for years.
Well, there was a time you were running around the dining room table and you slipped and fell and broke your arm.
Yes.
And there Jimmy was with his arm kind of like this, We all looked at it and decided he had a broken arm. And I think Dad came home shortly thereafter and we all agreed you had a broken arm.
Yeah.
That was it. He went out and got it fixed,
Went to the doctor's office, and they put it under some machine, and Doc Lewis went and yanked on it, pushed and pulled, and glued it together, wrapped it up, and away we went.
Yeah. Well, you were young.
Yeah.
That was cool.
That was my first broken bone, and then from then on, I think I probably set world's records.
Oh,
Mother worked as a volunteer at Redford Community Hospital.
Right.
Redford Emergency Community Hospital.
And
They
all-
knew me by my name.
They all said this is the only person that had a charge account at the hospital.
Yeah. They'd see me coming.
It was
and
one thing after another.
I had more casts than
Building-
anybody in the world.
Building hot rods and continually.
Yeah, you dropped one on you, didn't you?
Well,
Doing all
one,
sorts of-
well, that was when I was older. One was up on cement blocks, and the block broke, and my friend Jim Mudge was in the house, and it came down. It was a Ford straight axle, and it smashed my head right on the ground. And his mother happened to walk out. He was eating lunch or something, and here's this big pool of blood with feet around it. So she yelled, and Jim came out, and somehow, and he was a young guy, he picked the car up, and his mother pulled me out. And he tried later to do it, and couldn't budge the damn car enough to get the axle, you know, to move at all, but he was able to do it.
Jimmy built a lot of hot rods in there.
You came to bail me out of the hospital
They
one
were-
time, right? Yeah.
A number of
Got
times.
broadsided, going 100 and some miles an hour on Northwestern Highway when Mother and Dad were out of town.
Covered it all up.
Yeah, nobody ever knew. They wondered why I limped and had a cast and a bandage on my head, but
And then what happened, that we all grew up in a manner of speaking, and here we are.
Well, there's more to it than that.
who
Oh, yeah.
grew up, first of all?
Yeah, right. Well, I said as a manner of speaking.
Oh,
In a certain way, physically.
We have to
figuratively.
mention for posterity that I was the worst student of all, but my parents thought I was a real bummer, and I was the one who ended up getting numerous degrees. That's only fair.
That's
well,
true.
I think
I
you
didn't
should have more degrees than anybody.
Yes.
However, I think that I have to take claim to being the smartest in the family.
But, and if you dispute it, he's bigger than anybody.
Yeah, I'll
He'll
sit
pound
on
you-
it.
He'll pound you into the ground, so that's.
Well, I think Alan will acknowledge that I'm probably smarter than he is, so.
And I'm sort of, because I'm sitting in the middle, and I'm, sort of the middle of the road here.
And I'm more modest, too.
Yeah, the most modest man in the world.
And if this is gonna be really someday, we ought to include some footage of me walking on hot coals. I think that's only fair. Which I do.
You may address me as doctor.
Well, no,
That sounds like this is going to have to be continued.
There's
The
no-
hot
Yeah.
coals will need time to
Yeah,
prepare.
right, I mean, this kid.
There's no competition.
Fire up the barbecue, let's
This
go.
is getting into adulthood type thing,
Yeah.
so, you know.
Well,
next
I
session-
haven't reached there yet, so.
Yeah, well, physically, yeah.
I can still remember Mother telling me this happened when I was probably 37, 38, and I had gotten a fellowship from the National Heart Institute, and I was working on open heart surgery and this sort of thing. And Mother said, you know, Alan, had we thought that you would ever amount to anything, we would have given you a lot more help on the way. It's a true story. No kidding.
I think probably the smartest one in the family had to be Mother overall. And you look at, you know, she used to sit down and do the New York Times crossword puzzle in ink before anybody had pens. She never made a mistake, and the anagrams and all these scrambled words, I still remember her, and I used to check her all the time, you know, they'd say, well, the next day there was 17 words, and she would have 24, and I'd look up the balance, and she was right, they were in the dictionary, you know. And this went on in late into her 70s.
You're probably flattering her.
No, I don't think, I remember
Mother liked you
distinctly.
better than me.
Well, no wonder. I never burned down the garage.
My parents always picked on me, and you were the baby of the family, and they, you know, really, you got away with murder as a kid.
I was the handsomest with the most personality.
Yeah.
What do you expect?
Tallest, fattest.
Yeah.
Certainly the fattest, he certainly weighs most.
I weigh more than you guys, I'll say.
Yeah, both of us together probably. Well, okay, well, I think we should consider adulthood unless you have any particular suggestions, anyway.
Adultery, did you say?
Is this a final
You know,
vote?
he's thinking of passing this on to our
Grandchildren,
grandchildren and
great-grandchildren.
great-grandchildren.
Well, then you can have a copy for them and then one.
Yeah, adult content.
Adult.
An adult version, X-rated interview.
Alan, would you like to say how you got to college?
How I got the what?
How you got to college?
Oh, well, that
You
was
took
kind
the
of,
bus.
that was kind of weird because I, being an ex-soldier, I was eligible for the GI Bill, and I was considering going to television repair school, and at the time we had a black painter, a chap, I've forgotten his name at this point, and he said, Alan, you know, you're too smart to just be a television technician. Why don't you go to school under the GI Bill? And I thought about it, and I thought, by God, he's right. I am too smart for that. In all honesty. And
You're the second most honest man in the world after Jim.
yeah, so that's really what triggered me on to go to engineering school. Actually, I applied for medical school, but they said I'd already done a lot of engineering work, and you know, that's the direction I had to go. So I had no choice, which I found rather interesting because later on, you know, the whole thing shifted over to high-tech stuff. That's how I got my.
How did you apply? Where did you go?
I went to the University of Miami, Florida, which was the southernmost engineering school in the whole country, and it was no accident. I wanted to get warm. It was that simple. So I went to Suntan U, University of Miami, and we worked like dogs, you know. Engineering students do. It's the only way to get through. That's how I got started in college. And I swore when I got out I would never go to college again.
But you did.
And then he found out he had to work if he wasn't going to school.
Yes.
So that changed his mind once again. And then you went to,
UCLA. They got a master's in human physiology, which has been really handy because
Because you were wanting to get more degrees, which you did.
no, I wanted to be a biomedical engineer, and there were no schools in biomedical engineering at the time, so the only thing to do was to go for physiology and mix it with engineering. As a consequence, that's what I did. But it didn't work out. I did get the master's. Then I went to, they needed people at University of Missouri. I went there and got my doctorate.
When were you at Stanford? When were you at Stanford?
I really wasn't at Stanford. I went there to interview on a job back when I had a bachelor's degree as an acoustician. And so I went to Stanford and they introduced me to Dr. this and Dr. that, and Dr. So-and-so. And here I was with a bachelor's degree. I was pretty good at acoustics. And, you know, I began to talk to these people, and I suddenly realized that all these people with doctorates were going to do all the thinking, and I was going to do all the work, and it really didn't appeal to me. So I didn't go to work for Stanford.
so he went back to school. Anything to avoid work.
Yeah, well, I thought seriously about it, but, you know, I would be the low man on the totem pole. No, I taught at Cal Poly, you know, engineering, and I took a bunch of courses in life science. And you said Bert Rutan graduated from Cal Poly. He was probably one of my students. Maybe the one I caught cheating, I'm not sure.
Well, no, probably not in aerodynamics, he didn't cheat.
For grandchildren who are listening to all of this, and great-grandchildren, Bert Rutan was the designer of the Voyager, the only airplane in our age which flew all the way around the world with one fueling. miscellaneous other aircraft, one of which
Non-stop.
Robert built. Non-stop, yes, around the world, non-stop.
Yeah, that was only 4 or 5 years ago, wasn't it, or something like
Yeah.
that?
His brother Dick flew it along with somebody Jaeger,
Yeah.
young lady.
Very little woman.
Yeah, very light woman.
What is their connection to you?
Hmm?
Bert Rutan?
Connection is,
What has this got to do with
I
anything?
taught engineering at Cal Poly. Bert Rutan graduated from Cal Poly. And since I had the introduction to engineering for 2 years, and he went through about that time, he was probably one of my students.
Plus, Bob built a plane designed by Bert Rutan.
Right, called it very easy.
Yeah, and it wasn't very easy.
As I recall,
Very
hard.
Bob renamed it the Very Hard.
Yeah, right.
And there was an airplane wing hanging up in the wall in the bedroom, as I recall, and a motor in the front room,
In the living room, yes.
in the living room,
Living room.
and
Was it?
various body parts, airplane parts, that is, around the house.
And Margot and I met Bert Rutan one fine summer by flying our Very Easy in there, and we landed in Mojave Airport, desert, and Bert came over and checked it over for us, and was a little disturbed about the latch on the canopy. We changed that. He said, checked it over and thought it was a pretty good job, so on and so. And he brought us into town, we chatted a bit and all that sort of thing. And we went on our way flying up here. And, well, what more do you want to know about that? That's all there is to that.
I wired it.
Probably the only person who
Yeah,
built a
that's
plane in their bedroom in Berkeley.
Likely.
And I remember seeing it sub-assembled in the front yard when we came over, when we were getting ready to move
Yes.
to Illinois for a couple of years.
Or there was a picture in the front page of the Berkeley Gazette or something, and so on.
I know, I think we're all getting tired. I'd like to cap with just bringing a conclusion to the earliest thing we talked about.
Yeah.
And that is, when we last left this story, we left you in a prison camp. I
I
assume
got
that you
out.
ultimately got out.
Yes.
Could you tell us how that happened?
Well, one fine day after I'd been in there about a year and a half, on May 1st, which was the day that Berlin fell, and other types of celebrations then, but that was a week before the war ended. The Russian army broke through up by our camp and come in and liberated us. And that's how it happened. They come in there, all the guards, knowing they were coming, left the night before, and ran off. And they came in and took over the camp, and we spent 2 weeks there making arrangements getting out. And the Air Force flew us out of there in this little airport right nearby and flew us into France after 2 weeks there. Flew us into France, and then we hung around and got processed or something. The Army liked to process everybody,
Who was the general that liberated you?
Oh, it was a Russian general, a famous Russian general by the name of General Rokossovsky. And he was one of the big generals at Stalingrad and all that sort of thing. He was the head of the 3rd Ukrainian Army, and that's what liberated us. And he gave us a speech, and he got up and he said, "Vajaccio Zhizhava Zhizhava." And that means that we should have friendship with the United States and the Soviet Union.
And you guys are gonna have to cook your own breakfast.
Right.
Then don't go out after dark or we'll shoot you.
So